All right, let's talk about something that's definitely going to show up on your anesthesia finals: cervical spine surgery. This is one of those high-stakes topics where getting it right is absolutely critical. So in this masterclass, we're going to cut right through all the noise and give you a super clear, high-yield guide to absolutely nail this scenario, all the way from the pre-op clinic to handling post-op emergencies.
So here's our game plan. We're going to follow the patient's entire journey, starting with why they're even having the surgery and taking it all the way through to their postoperative care. Let's dive in. Okay, first things first, the why. You have to understand what the surgeon is trying to accomplish, because every single decision we make as anesthetists flows directly from their goals. Now, this is an absolute classic exam question, so you're going to want to lock this one in. When it comes right down to it, pretty much every spinal surgery is trying to do one of three things. And here they are. Number one, decompression. For us, that's a huge red flag for avoiding hypotension, which could really damage an already squished spinal cord. Number two, stabilization. This means our number one job is preventing any movement during intubation and positioning. And third, correction of a deformity. This usually means a longer surgery, and we need to be ready for potentially higher blood loss. So a really common reason for this surgery is something called radiculopathy. You can basically think of it as a pinched nerve in the neck. When one of those nerve roots gets compressed, it can send pain, numbness, or even weakness shooting down the arm. And if things like physical therapy don't work, well, surgery is the next step. But then there's myelopathy, and this is a whole different ballgame. This is much more serious. We're not just talking about a nerve root anymore. The spinal cord itself is being compressed. This can cause much bigger problems like clumsiness, trouble walking, or weird sensory feelings. The main goal of surgery here is just to stop things from getting any worse. All right, let's jump into a quick tour of the anatomy. Now, this isn't just for an exam, To really protect these delicate structures, we have to know exactly where they are and how they can get into trouble. So, when you look at a lateral C-spine X-ray, you can actually boil it down to these 4 parallel lines. If you see any kind of break or step in these lines, it screams instability. And that's a huge warning sign for us that we have to be incredibly careful with alignment during intubation and positioning to prevent a neurological injury. And if we loom right in on the top of the spine, we see this really unique relationship between C1, the atlas, and C2, the axis. It's the special joint that lets you turn your head. But with all those intricate ligaments, it's also a major weak spot, especially in patients with conditions like rheumatoid arthritis. At the end of the day, this is what it's all about. This is what we are there to protect: the spinal cord. This little cross-section shows the key pathways we're always thinking about: the posterior columns for your sense of position, the spinal thalamic tracts for pain and temperature, and the corticospinal tracts for motor function. Any damage here is just catastrophic. Okay, this graph is super important. It shows us something called autoregulation. Just like in the brain, a healthy spinal cord can keep its blood flow nice and steady as long as the mean arterial pressure stays somewhere between 60 and 120. But here's the kicker. In a compressed or injured cord, that ability is gone. Blood flow just becomes totally dependent on pressure. And that's exactly why how we manage blood pressure in the OR is so incredibly critical. A safe anesthetic doesn't just happen in the OR. It all starts way before that. The preoperative assessment for these cases is where we find all the risks and actually make our plan. It is absolutely non-negotiable. So one of the first things you'll want to know is the surgeon's plan of attack. Are they going from the front or the back? This table kind of breaks down what pushes them one way or the other, and for us, this changes everything. An anterior approach means we're worried about the airway. A posterior approach, well, that means we've got all the challenges of turning the patient prone.
So, if you're going to take anything away for your pre-op, here's your high-yield checklist. Number 1, document their baseline neurology. You can't tell if something new has happened if you don't know where they started. 2, ask about positions that make their symptoms worse, and then avoid them. 3, do a super detailed airway exam and really focus on their neck movement. And 4, always look at the imaging yourself.
Okay, we're in the OR. This is where the magic happens. And for your exam, this is the real meat of the topic. Our mission here is simple but absolutely critical. Protect that spinal cord from any kind of secondary hit. When it comes to the airway, our mantra is minimal neck movement. And that's why, most of the time, video laryngoscopy is our go-to technique. It just tends to give you a great view of the larynx with a lot less neck extension compared to direct laryngoscopy, which means less risk of messing with the spinal cord.
Now, this is a number you absolutely have to remember, a mean arterial pressure above 85 millimeters of mercury. Yeah, this target is kind of borrowed from data on acute spinal cord injury, but it's what we aim for in these high-risk elective cases. The whole idea is to really maximize blood flow to the spinal cord, especially since we're assuming its ability to autoregulate is probably impaired. And this is such a key point, one that's so easy to overlook. We get so focused on intubation, right? But as this quote shows, the act of just positioning the patient can actually be even riskier for the cord. Turning a patient prone has to be a slow, careful team sport with one person, usually the surgeon, whose only job is to control the head and neck. All right, so even when we do everything right, things can still go wrong. A huge part of being ready for your exams is thinking about the what-ifs and knowing exactly what to do. Let's run through the big ones.
Less than 0.5%. It sounds tiny, right? That's the incidence of a post-operative neck hematoma after an anterior surgery. But while it's rare, this is a can't-miss, potentially catastrophic complication. A hematoma that's expanding quickly in the neck can squash the trachea and lead to a lost airway in no time.
So, how do we spot the patients who are at a higher risk? Well, this slide gives you the red flags. You want to be extra careful with men over 65, smokers, and anyone who's had a long multi-level surgery. And what's really crucial to know is that most of these hematomas show up within the first 6 hours after surgery. That's our window of maximum vigilance. Okay, so you suspect a hematoma, the patient's in distress. What do? This is your emergency drill, and it's a classic Viva station. First, you call for help, and that means surgeons, senior anesthetists, everybody. Get ready for a difficult airway, maybe even a surgical one, and in a true life or death situation, you open the wound at the bedside. You just pop the clips to release that pressure. Then it's straight back to the OR. And our job isn't over just because the surgeon is done. We've got to make sure the recovery and handover are just as safe. Let's cover those key points. And that brings us to the final, really big question: to extubate or not to extubate? Especially after an anterior surgery, airway swelling is a huge concern. So doing a cuff leak test is a really smart move to check for that. Your decision here is all about balancing the risk of a post-extubation disaster against the risks of keeping the patient intubated. And you know what? Making that judgment call is really the hallmark of a skilled anesthetist.